Hey now. I originally planned to end the Star Wars feature with 7 videos reviewing all of the movies, but I decided not to really do it for 2 reasons. The first is that it's time-consuming and I'm eager to get to the next feature. The second is that there's not a whole lot I can say about each individual movie that hasn't been said many times. Pretty much everybody knows the plot of the main 6 movies, and how the original trilogy, I already covered it extensively on the John and Joe show, where me and my friend Joe did entire commentaries for each movie. But I didn't want to not do the movie reviews, so I decided to condense my reviews into 3 videos. In this video, I'll review the original trilogy, in the next video, I'll review the prequel trilogy, and in the last video, I'll review the Clone Wars movie, which I had actually never seen until now and never talked about it, so that'll be a full review like you guys are used to. The original trilogy I saw when I was a kid. We had a VHS tape that had all 3 movies on it, and I watched it all the time. I still remember the first time I watched them, it was nuts. I remember when I was 6 or 7, my favorite one was Return of the Jedi, because it had the most action, and my least favorite was The Empire Strikes Back, because it was really long and I wanted to get to Return of the Jedi. Kind of funny how time and maturity changes your opinion on things. The original Star Wars tells a pretty classic story. The galaxy is ruled by an evil empire, and there's a group of rebels fighting against it. Princess Leia is an important figure in the rebellion, and she has the schematics for the Empire's ultimate weapon, the planet-destroying space station called the Death Star. When the Empire raids her ship, she gives the plans to some droids and drops them off on the planet Tatooine, instructing them to find a Jedi named Obi-Wan Kenobi. They come into the possession of Luke Skywalker, who takes them to Kenobi, who insists that Luke join him in going to Alderaan, where the rebel base is. Luke wants nothing more than to get off the planet, but his aunt and uncle are giving him a hard time, and he just can't up and leave, but it's a moot point when the Empire kills his family. They meet up with Han Solo, a smuggler, and they try to travel to Alderaan, but the Empire destroys this planet, and they all get captured by the Empire, though they manage to rescue the princess, but Obi-Wan dies in the process, and they get to another rebel base with the Death Star plans, where they find a weakness in the Death Star, and in a calculated strike they manage to finally destroy it, dealing a severe blow to the Empire. The second movie, The Empire Strikes Back, has the Empire hunting the rebels, and the Emperor's apprentice, the Sith Lord named Darth Vader, finds out that the pilot who destroyed the Death Star was Luke Skywalker, who turns out to be his son. Meanwhile, Luke is being trained as a Jedi by Yoda, a Jedi Master who was under self-imposed exile. The Empire captures Luke's friends, and he gives up his training to try and rescue them. Han is frozen in carbonite, and Darth Vader defeats Luke, severing his hand, and tells him he's his father. Luke rejects this and escapes, and is rescued by the rest of the crew. The third one, Return of the Jedi, has Luke rescuing Han, who had been sold to the gangster Jabba the Hutt. Luke then returns to Yoda to finish his training, but Yoda tells him he's now a Jedi and must face Vader before dying himself. There's a second Death Star, which actually has the Emperor on board, and the rebels launch one last huge battle against it, with the ground forces turning off the shield, and the space forces working to destroy it, while Luke and Darth Vader have their final struggle. Luke beats Vader, and the Emperor looks to make Luke his new apprentice, replacing his father, but Luke rejects the Emperor, who tries to kill him. Darth Vader redeems himself by saving his son and destroying the Emperor, but he dies from his wounds. Each of these movies is great, but as I mentioned, my opinion of them has changed over time. The first movie is really strong, because although it's part of a much larger saga, it also stands alone on its own as a strong story. When it was first released, nobody had any idea that it was part of something bigger. It was just called Star Wars. It wasn't until a little bit later when it was retroactively renamed Star Wars Episode 4: A New Hope, promising that not only would there be sequels, but also prequels. Each character is an archetype, but they work well. Luke is the courageous farm boy caught up in something bigger than him. Obi-Wan is the wise old mentor. Han Solo is the wise-cracking swashbuckler. Leia is the spunky action girl. Each character fills a clearly defined role that has been done a million times, but instead of coming off as cliché, they come off as loving tributes to the characters and stories that had come before. In a lot of ways, Star Wars is a mixture of an old samurai movie, a western, an epic high fantasy, and sci-fi. It has elements of all these. Even though the saga would continue, you're not led to believe that there's anything more than just this one story. Star Wars is a classic, but if it's got one flaw, it's probably the acting. There are some really great veteran actors such as Alec Guinness and Peter Cushing, and great newcomers for the time like Harrison Ford, But the problem is that most of the cast was either new, or they just didn't care that much. Alec Guinness, for example, hated Star Wars, and he thought it was a shitty movie. And although Peter Cushing was great as the Empire's Grand Moff Tarkin, he was nearing the end of his career and he wasn't in great health, so his performance is somewhat subdued. I'm not saying the acting is bad, but the thing is the Star Wars movies have never really been known for their acting. It's all about the characters and the themes and the spectacle. It's not the smartest movie in the world, but it's definitely one of the most fun. And it's easy to overlook its flaws because it's perfect escapist entertainment. I'm going to give it a 9 out of 10. Empire Strikes Back was darker and more serious with ongoing themes, and it showed that just because they blew up the Death Star, it didn't mean the Empire was gone, and things were still really bad. When I was a kid, I liked it less because it had less action and it was a slower-paced movie, but as an adult, it's my favorite in the saga for those very reasons. It focuses less on intense battles and swashbuckling and more on the characters themselves, who get some great development. It also had the best script out of all the movies, though some of the best lines were improvised by the actors, who were all coming into their own. I also like the special effects the best, especially the puppetry, like Yoda. These days, Yoda is a CGI effect, and it looks good, but honestly, the puppet looked just as good 30 years earlier. Unlike the original Star Wars, you knew that there were more coming, because very little is resolved for the heroes at the end. Luke lost a hand, Han is captured and frozen, Luke's training is not complete, and the rebels have been dealt some serious blows. The Empire, they aren't showing any signs of going away. It really is the depressing one of the series. But it's for this reason that I think it shines. Empire Strikes Back, it's a 10 out of 10. It's one of my favorite movies. Return of the Jedi was more like the first movie, and in some ways it was sort of an attempt at remaking it. Even the very first scene is similar to the very first scene of Episode 4. It begins on Tatooine and ends with the destruction of a Death Star, though this time in a much more final fashion. The dark themes and mature feel of the second film were gone, in favor of basically doing the first movie on steroids. Though there's some really silly stuff, like the Ewoks, who are like little teddy bears that help out the ground forces to fight off the Empire and get the Death Star's shield disabled. That being said, if you like action, it has the most out of the original trilogy, with spectacular space battles, lightsaber duels, and crazy explosions. It's easily the least smart of the original trilogy, and it pales in comparison to the first two, but it's still great in its own way. I just wish it had more of its own identity instead of basically being a redux of the first one. You know, it's crazy how much stuff happens on Tatooine. It just happens that Han's nemesis Jabba lives there, so the entire first part echoes the first movie. And I have no problems with the Empire building a second improved Death Star, but it comes off as less intimidating than the first one. The best part of the movie is near the end. The scenes between Luke, his father, and the Emperor. This is great shit. The Emperor was played by Ian McDiarmid, who plays him like a wizened old evil wizard from a fantasy film, but he exudes power and menace, and the whole interplay between him and Luke is great. I'll give Return of the Jedi an 8 out of 10. I'm being a bit generous, but despite some silly moments and a lot of rehashed plot, it really is a lot of fun. You just have to kind of accept that it's basically the original movie on steroids. Join me tomorrow and we'll tackle the prequels.